Belgium, October 1917. 954 men of the 13th Battalion marched into the fog of no man's land. By dawn, the mud had claimed them all. No bodies, no equipment, not even a boot print remained. But in the waterlogged trenches, they found a journal written in mud that never dried, speaking of horrors that still stalk these fields today. I am the War Maestro, and tonight we uncover the terrible truth of why soldiers still whisper. In the mud of Passchendaele, the dead don't rest, they recruit. The Third Battle of Ypres began as many Great War offensives did, with thunder. Not from the heavens, but from thousands of British guns that had been firing for 2 weeks straight, turning the Belgian countryside into a cratered moonscape. But nature herself seemed to revolt against man's ambitions. The heaviest rains in 30 years transformed the battlefield into something otherworldly, a primordial soup of mud, blood, and the dissolving remains of the fallen. Military records from the 13th Battalion, King's Regiment, Liverpool, detail their position on the 12th of October, 1917. They were to advance, under cover of darkness, toward the German lines near what was once the village of Passchendaele. The orders, preserved in the Imperial War Museum, specified an 0300 hours attack time. The battalion's strength was logged at 1,027 men. By sunrise, 954 of them would vanish without a trace. Captain James Thorne's last diary entry, dated the 11th of October, reveals the men's growing unease. The mud here is different, wrong somehow. Stephen swears he saw it move yesterday, far from any shell impacts. The men whisper about sounds in the night, not German guns or the usual groans of the wounded, but something else. A kind of singing, they say, coming from the deeper shell holes. Tomorrow we advance. God help us all. The night of the 12th of October brought a peculiar fog, thick and luminous, according to multiple accounts from adjacent units. The 13th Battalion moved out on schedule, their progress tracked by forward observers until they reached the first line of shell craters. Then, at precisely 0317 hours, all contact ceased. The last radio transmission, partially preserved in static-filled recordings at the British Military Archives, contained only 6 words. They're already here, in the mud. Private Thomas Wheeler, of the neighboring 11th Battalion, would later describe that night in a 1925 interview with the Imperial War Museum. The interviewer noted how Wheeler's hand shook uncontrollably when speaking of it, and how he would occasionally pause to press his palms against his ears, as if trying to block out some remembered sound. His voice cracked repeatedly as he recounted what he witnessed from his forward observation post, stopping several times to compose himself when the memories became too vivid. The mist wasn't natural, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It seemed to pulse with a sickly green luminescence, like the glow of 1,000 decaying flares. Through my field glasses, I could make out the shapes of the 13th moving forward, but something was wrong. There were other figures in the fog, moving against the flow of our advancing troops. Wheeler's report, marked secret until 1967, described soldiers in British uniforms, but ones that seemed decades old and rotted. Their movements were wrong, a jerking, shambling gait that no living man could maintain. Most disturbing were their faces, sunken, hollow-eyed, with skin that seemed to slip and shift like the mud itself. Lance Corporal David Murray's recovered journal provides another perspective. His unit was stationed in a support trench when the 13th began their advance. "The rats have all fled," he wrote. "Even the bloody rats won't stay here anymore. Been having dreams of drowning in mud that whispers." Jenkins says he saw something crawling out of a shell hole last night, wearing a British uniform from 15, but he says the flesh was like wet clay. The German accounts add another chilling layer. Translated intercepted communications from that sector speak of ghost soldiers appearing in their trenches for weeks before the attack. Men in mud-caked British uniforms who vanished when shot, leaving only wet footprints. The German commander, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, noted in his personal diary, "This cursed ground is hungry. It has tasted too much blood, too many bodies, and now I fear, it has learned to walk." As the 13th Battalion pushed deeper into no man's land, the surrounding units reported hearing strange sounds carrying through the mist. Not screams or gunfire, but a sort of hollow, wet singing, as if a choir were performing from the bottom of a flooded cathedral. It was the last thing anyone would hear from the 13th Battalion before the fog swallowed them whole. 3 days after the 13th Battalion's disappearance, a single soldier stumbled into the British lines. Private William Connor was found by a night sentry, crawling on his hands and knees, his fingernails torn and bleeding from clawing his way through the mud. The medical officer who first examined him reported that Connor was barely conscious, alternating between hysterical laughter and quiet sobbing, his uniform caked in mud that seemed to move of its own accord. Most disturbing was his reaction to water. He would become violently agitated at the sight of it, screaming about faces in the puddles. Military medical records show he was the only confirmed survivor of the 13th advance, though what he had survived would haunt him until his death in 1963. After 2 weeks of treatment for shell shock at a field hospital, Connor provided a formal statement to military intelligence. The official transcript, declassified in 1988, reveals the horror of what happened in the mist that night. We were about 400 yards into no man's land when Sergeant Phillips spotted the first one. Connor recalled, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his tea. A British soldier, standing in a shell hole, just standing there in neck-deep water, perfectly still. Phillips called out the challenge word, but instead of responding, the figure slowly turned. Its face. Dear God, its face was made of mud. Connor's account describes how the battalion continued forward, only to find more figures emerging from the fog. Some wore uniforms from the wars beginning in 1914, others from more recent battles. All shared the same haunting characteristic. Their flesh seemed to flow and shift like wet clay. Their eyes were deep, dark holes that glistened with muddy water. They were all around us then, Connor continued, rising from shell holes, pulling themselves out of the mud. I saw Corporal Wright empty his rifle into one. The bullets just passed through, leaving holes that closed like ripples in a pond. Then they started, joining with the mud itself. The ground beneath our feet became like quicksand, but quicksand filled with reaching hands and drowning faces. The most disturbing part of Connor's testimony was corroborated by 3 separate German prisoners captured weeks later. He described how the mud itself seemed to come alive, forming into the shapes of soldiers, thousands of them, all the lost and fallen of Passchendaele, given horrible new form by the earth that had consumed them. The last thing I heard was Captain Thorne shouting for us to fall back. Connor whispered, but there was nowhere to fall back to. The mud was alive behind us as well, filled with the faces of dead men. I ran. God help me, I ran. And behind me, I heard my mates screaming as they sank, their voices becoming wet gurgles until there was nothing but that awful singing. In the aftermath of the 13th Battalion's disappearance, the British High Command launched a secret investigation. Colonel Herbert Blackwood, a veteran intelligence officer, was tasked with finding a rational explanation for the loss of nearly 1,000 men without a trace. His confidential reports, recently discovered in a forgotten War Office archive, reveal a man struggling to maintain his grip on reality. Initial findings suggest a possible German chemical weapon, Blackwood wrote on the 20th of October, 1917. Yet analysis of soils from the area show no trace of known agents. More disturbing are the anomalies in the mud itself. Laboratory tests indicate impossible levels of organic matter, as if the earth itself has become saturated with dissolved human remains. The investigation team interviewed soldiers from adjacent units who had witnessed strange phenomena in the weeks leading up to the disaster. A young lieutenant from the Royal Engineers described how his men refused to dig new trenches in certain areas, claiming their shovels hit something that squirmed. Several runners reported taking wrong turns in the fog and finding themselves in trenches that shouldn't exist, manned by soldiers wearing uniforms from battles long past. Most telling was the discovery made by a Belgian mining engineer attached to the investigation. Using early ground-penetrating equipment, he detected large cavities in the battlefield, cavities that seemed to shift position between surveys. His final report before requesting immediate transfer, noted that the readings resembled a vast digestive system beneath the earth. Blackwood's investigation took a darker turn when his team attempted to recover bodies from the area. The ground appears to resist excavation, he reported. Dig sites fill with water faster than they can be pumped clear, yet the water table readings make this impossible. More concerning are the sounds our men report hearing from these flooded pits, voices calling out names and orders, as if an entire battalion were submerged below. The final page of Blackwood's report, marked "For High Command Only," bears a single haunting paragraph: "I can no longer deny what the evidence suggests. This battlefield has become something else, a place where the thousands of dead have somehow changed the very nature of the earth. The mud doesn't just consume the fallen, it preserves them in some horrifying way. The 13th Battalion isn't missing. They're still out there, still on patrol, just changed. And God help me, I think they're recruiting." By late October 1917, the disappearance of the 13th Battalion had become a dark legend among the troops. Despite official orders to avoid discussing the incident, soldiers whispered about it in the trenches, and several units refused night patrol duties in that sector. The horror had begun to spread. Captain Malcolm Ross of the 5th Royal Scots volunteered to lead a search party, despite Colonel Blackwood's warnings. His team consisted of 12 men, each chosen for their combat experience and steady nerves. Their mission, officially recorded as a reconnaissance patrol, was to investigate recent reports of British soldiers seen wandering in no man's land long after the 13th's disappearance. Ross's field journal, recovered 3 days later, documents their descent into nightmare. The 1st of November, 2300 hours, spotted 3 figures in British uniforms near the forward line. They appear to be soldiers from the 13th, but their movements are wrong. Murray swears one of them is his brother James, who was with the 13th that night. But James Murray died at Ypres in 1915, 2 years ago. The patrol pushed forward into the mist. Their last radio transmission, logged by the forward command post, reported contact with what they thought were survivors. Then the screaming began. Private George Winters, the only member of Ross's patrol to return, was found 2 days later, hiding in a flooded shell hole. The rescue party described how he had pressed himself into the mud wall, eyes wide and unblinking, muttering the names of his patrol members over and over like a prayer. His hair had turned completely white, and he had torn his identification tags into tiny pieces, repeating, "They use our names, they call us with our names," whenever anyone approached him. His report describes how the mud itself had reached up to grab them, taking the form of soldiers they knew, dead men from past battles wearing the remnants of rotted uniforms. "It wasn't just the 13th out there," Winters testified in a sealed statement. "I saw men wearing patches from every unit that ever fought at Passchendaele. The mud. It's learned from them all, learned to wear their faces, speak with their voices. Captain Ross, he found his old commander from Salm out there, walked right up to shake his hand. The thing wore Major Philip's face perfectly, right until Ross got close. Then the face began to melt." The most disturbing part of Winters' account describes what he saw just before fleeing. Captain Ross and the others being pulled down into the mud, their bodies dissolving and reforming, becoming part of the horror they'd come to investigate. "They were screaming at first," Winters whispered. "Then their screams changed to that singing. That awful, hollow singing that echoes across no man's land every night now. They're all out there still, wearing uniforms of mud, waiting for more to join them." By mid-November 1917, High Command could no longer ignore the mounting horror at Passchendaele. The disappearances had continued, isolated sentries, repair crews, forward observers, all vanishing into the mud. Those who patrolled the trenches at night reported hearing familiar voices calling out from no man's land, the voices of men long dead or recently taken. Major Richard Harrison, a veteran of the Somme and decorated artillery officer, proposed a desperate solution. His plan, found in sealed orders dated the 15th of November, called for a sustained artillery barrage to cleanse the earth itself. Thousands of shells filled with quicklime and salt, intended to purify the corrupted ground. "The enemy we face is not the Germans," Harrison wrote in his operational brief. "This ground has become a graveyard that refuses to keep its dead. Every man we've lost here has become part of something hungry, something that wears their faces and memories like masks. We must burn it out, no matter the cost." The barrage began at midnight on the 16th of November. Over 300 guns fired for 6 hours straight, turning the battlefield into an inferno of explosions and caustic smoke. Harrison observed from the forward command post, watching through field glasses as the corrupted earth was churned up and burned. But the horror they'd created proved beyond their power to destroy. Lieutenant Stephen Clark's account describes what happened next. "The shells threw up great gouts of mud, but the mud, it kept trying to take shape, even as it fell. I saw faces in it, hands reaching out. The more we shelled it, the more it seemed to wake up. Then we heard the singing start, thousands of voices from below the earth, all singing march songs from different regiments, different years." Major Harrison just stared, his field glasses dropping from nerveless fingers. The command post's last communication came at 0627 hours. "They're coming out of the craters. Everything we've thrown at them, all the shells. We've just made it stronger. The dead are rising from the earth in waves, wearing uniforms of mud and bone." Harrison recognized his brother among them, killed at Ypres in 15. "Oh God, they're at the door now. They want us to join their ranks. They want us all to." The message ends there. When reinforcements reached the command post at dawn, they found only empty uniforms, saturated with mud that still seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Today, the fields of Passchendaele appear peaceful. Memorial stones dot the landscape, and tourists walk the preserved trenches, taking photos and reading plaques about the battle's enormous toll. But according to local farmers and groundskeepers, something still walks these fields when the fog rolls in. In 2015, Belgian archaeologist Marie Deveau led a team conducting a survey of previously undiscovered war graves. Her report, filed with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, contains disturbing observations. Ground-penetrating radar shows anomalies that defy explanation. Cavities appear and disappear between scans. More troubling are the audio recordings from our underground sensors, what sounds like thousands of voices singing old marching songs from various WWI regiments. The most recent incident occurred in October 2023, when battlefield guide Thomas Bennett was leading an evening tour group. His statement to local authorities describes a familiar horror. "The fog came in unusually thick. Through it, we saw soldiers in British uniforms walking in formation. At first, I thought they were reenactors, but their uniforms, they were made of mud, and their faces kept shifting, like clay being molded by invisible hands." Bennett's group fled, but not before taking several photographs. One of the tourists, Mary Sinclair, later checked herself into a psychiatric facility. Her admission notes describe how she recognized her great-uncle among the mud-formed soldiers, a man who had vanished at Passchendaele over a century ago. She swears he smiled at her, mud dripping from his lips, and called her by name. Most showed only fog, but one image, now sealed in military archives, captured something extraordinary, a formation of soldiers emerging from the mist. Their uniforms bore the insignia of the 13th Battalion, King's Regiment, and their faces. Their faces were those of men who had marched into the fog on that terrible night in 1917. The most compelling evidence comes from James Connor, great-grandson of the sole survivor, who visited the battlefield in 2024. He found his great-grandfather's dog tags, impossibly preserved, lying in a fresh puddle of mud. Attached was a note written in wet earth that somehow held its form, still on patrol. "The mud remembers, the dead remember, and we're all still here, waiting in the mist for others to join our eternal march." Military historians still debate what really happened to the 13th Battalion at Passchendaele. Their fate remains officially listed as missing in action, one of many tragic losses in a war that devoured millions. But on foggy nights, when the mist rolls across those ancient battlefields, locals say you can still hear the sound of boots marching through mud, and the faint, hollow singing of men who never returned home, soldiers who found a different kind of immortality in the hungry earth of no man's land. If this tale from the War Maestro's archive left you checking the ground beneath your feet, there are more dark chronicles waiting to be unearthed. Subscribe to join our ranks. The Mud always welcomes new recruits. Ring that notification bell. You'll want to know when the next patrol ventures into history's darker territories. Share this account with fellow seekers of military horror. After all, some stories refuse to stay buried. And leave a comment below. Have you ever walked an old battlefield and felt watched? Or perhaps you've heard the distant sound of marching where no soldiers should be. Remember, in the fields of Passchendaele, every puddle holds a reflection, and not all of them are your own.